Today on the Perception in Action podcast, how do you know whether a training activity that is very different from your target sport will lead to transfer? Is there value in non-specific practice? Does it depend on skill level? What is a donor sport? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to dive into the issue of specificity of practice, asking the question, is there any value in using a training task that is very different from the main sport you're training for? In doing this, I want to touch on a really interesting new concept proposed by Renee Wormhout, Keith Davids, and colleagues, the donor sport. I was inspired to tackle these topics now because of an article that was recently shared on Twitter by Derek Florko, @SaberCoach, who is a great follow if you're interested in analytics and sports science, particularly as it relates to baseball. The article is titled, Catching Ping Pong Balls to Improve Quiet Eye for Golf. The article describes how performing a drill which involves catching fast-moving ping pong balls with your hands can, quote, be used to develop skills like hand-eye coordination that are essential for golf performance, end quote, and improve the quiet eye, leading to, quote, significant improvement in the golfer's ability to control impact point on the club face, end quote. So, this is clearly an example of a non-specific practice activity. But would it help? For me, the idea that catching ping pong balls with your hand would help your golf game is extremely unlikely for a few reasons. First, let's do a basic task analysis of the two activities, which I've said in previous episodes is something you should be doing all of the time with your sport and practice activities. Catching a ping pong ball that is launched at you involves tracking the moving ball with your eyes using smooth pursuit eye movements. Research, including some of my own, has shown that it also typically involves the use of binocular visual information from your two eyes so that the closure of the hand around the ball can be precisely timed. Hitting a golf ball, on the other hand, involves striking a completely stationary object with a tool, a club. In order to keep the eye on the ball, the golfer does not use eye movements. They just need to stabilize their fixation. If vision is used to guide the path of the club during the swing, it's going to have to be peripheral vision, so binocular information is not likely going to be involved. In other words, these two tasks are completely different. Basically, the only thing they have in common is that they both involve a small white ball. Why are these differences important? Well, as I've talked about several times on the podcast now, almost every piece of evidence we have from research indicates that only highly similar tasks lead to positive transfer of training. I discussed this back in episode 77, but let me give you 3 examples here to illustrate. The first is the phenomenon of the Especial skill, first documented by Keach and colleagues in 2005. Let's walk through an example. If you ask an experienced basketball player to make set shots at different distances from the basket, you will find there is almost a perfect linear relationship between performance and distance. That is, the percentage of made shots gradually declines as you move further from the hoop. In the Keach et al. Study, the decline is from about 85% made at 9 feet to about 60% made at 21 feet. The relationship is so clean that it's very easy to predict what percentage a shooter will make from some weird distance like 13.5 feet. But note, however, I said almost a perfect linear relationship. There is one severe anomaly. At a distance of 15 feet, which is where the foul line is in basketball, the shooting percentage based on the linear relationship should be about 70%. But the actual shooting percentage you get is over 80%. If you look at the graph, it's like you're walking along a smooth road and run into the base of Mount Everest. The basic effect is really not that surprising. Because basketball players spend hours and hours practicing set shots from 15 feet, most are exceptionally good at it. It is an especial skill. We get good at things we practice a lot. Duh. The point I want to emphasize is the complete lack of spread of this effect. If practicing a 15-foot shot makes us really, really good from 15 feet, then surely if we take one step back and attempt a 16-foot shot, we should still see some advantage. Taking a 16-foot shot is almost the same action as a 15-foot one, right? Well, we don't. The shooting percentage 1 foot either behind or in front of the foul line is exactly what would be predicted based on the distance alone. Practicing hours and hours of foul shots does not result in any type of extra improvement at these very similar distances. The Mount Everest of practice specificity is very, very steep on either side. The same is also true if we slightly modify the action being performed. For example, in experiment 3 of the Keach study, when participants were asked to make jump shots instead of set shots, the Especial skill completely disappeared. That is, the shooting percentage at 15 feet was now exactly as predicted based on distance alone. So, simply adding a jump to the action completely flattened Mount Everest. If even a small change in the task, like moving the shooter back 1 foot or adding a jump to the shot, completely eliminates the extra benefit of practicing foul shots, imagine what would happen if we asked the athlete to perform a completely different sporting task, like making a soccer penalty kick from 15 feet. Do you think there would be any transfer? Come on. The second example I want to look at relates to the claim in this article about the value of developing general skills, like quote-unquote eye-hand coordination. As I will discuss in a few moments when I get to donor sports, while this may have some value at lower levels of skill and competition, in my opinion, the concept of generalized perceptual motor skills like eye-hand coordination, speed, balance, agility, etc., loses all meaning when we're talking about high-level athletes. As an example, consider the study by Kuzmits and Adams, which examined the relationship between test scores in the NFL Combine and variables related to on-field performance, such as games played per year, average yards per reception or carry, etc. Surely there should be some relationship here. For example, a wide receiver that has good speed, as measured by a 40-yard dash, should perform better in the NFL because obviously speed matters, right? Well, no. If we look at the results for wide receivers, only 4 out of a possible 80 correlations between combine scores and performance measures were statistically significant in the study. Note, that is exactly 5%, or the number we would predict we'd get purely based on chance. The main conclusion of this paper was, quote, using correlation analysis, we find no consistent statistical relationship between combine tests and professional football performance, end quote. And quote, this study should encourage team personnel to consider the potential benefits of overhauling the combine process with the goal of creating a more valid system for predicting player success. Why don't general non-sport specific abilities like 40-yard dash times, vertical leap height, and broad jump distance predict wide receiver performance in the NFL? Because what matters at high-level sport is not general abilities like quote-unquote speed. It is sport-specific skills, like being able to run precise routes, read the defense, and go up and make a play on the ball in the air. If general skills assessed by non-sport specific tests have no relationship to on-field performance, why in the world would we want to turn around and use these tests to train our athletes? Again, it's not an effective use of practice time in my humble opinion. The final one I want to talk about is one of my favorite anecdotal examples. During an exhibition game in 2004, Albert Pujols, one of the best major league batters in the game at the time and a sure first ballot Hall of Famer, faced off against Jenny Finch, softball pitcher from the University of Arizona. Now let's think about this. Both softball and baseball batting require good quote-unquote eye-hand coordination and good quote-unquote vision. So, with all his many years practicing baseball batting, Pujols surely should have immediately been able to step up and crush a home run off Finch. But what actually happened? Well, as you can see in the video I've included in the show notes, he struck out on 3 pitches without making any contact with the ball. So in other words, his years and years of preparation practicing a slightly different sport allowed him to produce an outcome that someone who had never picked up a bat in their life could have done. Why did this happen? Because the softball is pitched underhand and from a closer distance, its trajectory and the kinematics of the pitcher's delivery are very different. In other words, there's a significant difference in perceptual information. Also, with the ball rising as it approaches the batter, a different swing is required to get on the plane of the pitch, so there is also a substantial difference in the coordination dynamics. One of the main messages I'm trying to get across today is that when these type of differences are present, we don't get good transfer training. So again, going back to the ping pong drill I started with, if there's virtually no transfer from baseball to softball, two different hitting skills, why in the world would we expect there to be transfer between catching and striking with a club? To finish up this example, of course I have no doubt with some more practice, Pujols would have gotten very good at softball hitting. But how would he have gotten good? Say it with me, sport-specific practice. In order to adjust to the different perceptual information and task dynamics of softball, he would need to practice under conditions with these things present. I know it's not a sexy thing to say, but if you want to get really, really good at skill A, you need to practice variations of skill A, not skill B, C, or D. Everything we know about transfer of training points to the importance of specificity and indicates that tasks with a small degree of overlap in terms of their perceptual motor demands, like catching a ping pong ball and driving a golf ball, are very unlikely to have any influence on each other, even though they may be a lot of fun. So, does all this high degree of specificity mean that we should never do anything besides our main sport in training? Thankfully, no, because beyond the basic issue of transfer, there are of course multiple other benefits to diversification in sports training, including reducing the chance of injury and burnout. Sticking with just the issues of performance and transfer of training, there is a growing body of research showing that at lower levels of skill, there can be some clear benefits to non-sport specific training. However, and this is another one of the key points I want to get across in today's episode, this does not mean that you can just go around willy-nilly choosing practice drills. Doing something with a ball will not necessarily help with all ball sports. There needs to be some overlap, and not just at a superficial level. I think a really useful concept in trying to understand which non-sport specific activities will be useful for a given sport is that of a donor sport. I really like this idea, which is described in detail in the great book, The Athletic Skills Model, because it's firmly grounded in the theory of ecological dynamics. Because of this, it provides a clear rationale for choosing which activities will help a given sport and which won't. The Athletic Skills Model, or ASM, advocates early experience with a diverse range of activities, and is consistent with the viewpoint I just mentioned a few moments ago that you need a transition from diversification to specialization as the athletes develop. It is proposed that athletes need to become versatile and adaptive movers before they can become expert athletes. Furthermore, they need to become attuned to affordances, that is, opportunities for action, in sports performance contexts. In the ASM, the key to becoming an adaptive mover, and this attunement, is the use of so-called donor sports, which emphasize exploratory practice and guided discovery. Donor sports activities are ones which share some of the athletic movement functions and affordances required for successful performance in the athlete's primary target sport. In ecological dynamics terms, the donor sport and primary sport should have some overlap in their affordance landscapes. As an example, consider training for the primary sport of soccer using the donor sport of parkour. For those that don't know, parkour involves moving from one point to another, using a variety of actions like jumps, somersaults, running, rolling, etc., through a complex, unstructured environment. As discussed in detail in a recent article by Strafford and colleagues, it is one of the main donor sports recommended in the ASM. Returning to the soccer example, a sidestep maneuver needed to drive past a defender in soccer shares some of the same movement skills and coordination dynamics and involves a similar affordance, obstacle avoidance, to moving around an object in parkour. It also involves some similarities in the perceptual information, distance and time to contact with obstacles and size of gaps between obstacles, that is used to guide the action, although I'll return to this point in a second. So in theory, it remains to be tested, practicing parkour should result in positive transfer of training to soccer performance for young athletes. One of the main reasons parkour is championed in the ASM, as opposed to some other movement-based sport like gymnastics or figure skating, is its open and exploratory nature. Because the athlete is not following instructions to perform a prescribed set of movements that have a specific form, it is more likely that they will develop skills adapted to the constraints of their own intrinsic dynamics, leading to, again in theory, improved transfer. According to the ASM, donor sports like parkour are particularly good for underdeveloped skills involved in the athlete's primary sport, like balance and postural control. As opposed to doing uncoupled drills to develop these abilities, parkour allows them to be self-organized in a perception-action coupled environment. To quote the Strafford article, abilities deemed critical to athlete development can be donated by parkour, such as fluidity of movement, safe landing strategies, creativity in negotiating gaps and obstacles, and perception of information and related decision-making." End quote. While I think the ASM and the concept of the donor sport is a good start towards choosing non-sport specific practice exercises, there are of course some issues that still need to be resolved. The big one for me is how we transition from general to specific skills, in particular in terms of the specifying information. While parkour does involve going around obstacles in between gaps, the objects involved are stationary and inanimate. So in a sense, parkour has some of the same issues that I've been harping on about dribbling around cones. Specifically, the information used for avoidance and the decisions involved, for example, why you go left or right, why you choose one particular gap over another, will be very different in parkour and team sports like basketball and soccer. Critically, in team sports, gaps open and close based on the movements of opponents, and the opponent's body kinematics provide important information which allow a performer to guide their movements. So I think it would be important for future research to investigate the best way to transition between the general skills developed in donor sports and sport-specific coupled skills. But I would definitely highly encourage you to check out the ASM book, link in the show notes. To put a bow on all of this, I'm not trying to say that I know all of the answers about how to design effective practice exercises. I just want to encourage people to think about the rationale for things they are using. As I've said many times now, the key first step to designing an effective non-sport specific practice exercise is a thorough task analysis of the skill you're trying to develop. Does it involve the use of peripheral vision or mostly central vision? Are objects moving or stationary? Does the performer need to react as quickly as possible as soon as the target appears, or do you want them to only act when it's appropriate? Is the affordance involved striking, interception, collision avoidance, etc.? Is there a decision-making component involved? Everything we know about transfer of training tells us we need a large amount of overlap between the perceptual information and task dynamics of the two tasks for effective transfer to occur. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials including an extra monthly episode and transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.